All right, so what are we to make of this story? Obviously, it centers around a man with leprosy, which in the Bible is a term for a skin disease of some sort. There's debates about exactly whether it's the same as what's today known as Hansen's disease, which is a disease in which a person's body, in a sense, decays while you're still alive, and it can be terminal. It can ultimately end up killing you very slowly over time, or whether it was a broader term that applied to any kind of skin disease. The traditional interpretation of leprosy in the Bible is that it is the ancient form of what today we know as Hansen's disease, and that it was serious, that it was deadly, and certainly that if someone contracted leprosy, which was contagious, they would end up being exiled from the community, separated, quarantined, so to speak, for the rest of their lives because there was no cure for it. In any case, what Jesus here is encountering is a man who has this skin disease, this leprosy. And the man comes before Jesus, and he does something interesting. He not only asks Jesus to heal him, he also honors Jesus by kneeling before him and by saying, "If you will, you can make me clean." So this is a profound statement of faith on the part of the man with leprosy. Why? Well, in part just because Jesus has just begun his public ministry in the Gospel of Mark, and yet already this man has enough faith to recognize that Jesus has the power to take his disease away, to heal him and to cure him and to make him clean, because what leprosy was regarded as doing was making a person unclean. We'll see that in a moment when we look at the Old Testament background. This is a particularly strong act of faith, too, in light of the Old Testament story of Naaman the Syrian. This isn't the Old Testament reading for today, but it's worth keeping in mind. If you go back to the book of Kings, I think it's 2 Kings chapter 5, there's the story of Naaman the Syrian, who was a general in the army of Syria, and he was a man who had leprosy. And what happens in the story, just to make a long story short, he goes into Israel, he's sent into Israel to the prophet Elisha, so that the prophet Elisha might heal him. And what's interesting about the passage is when Naaman the Syrian comes to the king of Israel to tell about his desire to be healed, first he goes to the king, and the king says this, "Am I God to kill and to make alive, that this man sends word to me to cure a man of his leprosy?" That's 2 Kings chapter 5, verse 7. So notice, in the Old Testament, the king of Israel's assumption is only God can cure leprosy. It's that serious. It's that terrible of a disease. So if you fast forward to the New Testament, you could actually even infer that when this leper comes up to Jesus and says, "If you will, you can make me clean," there's a kind of implied faith that Jesus is more than just the King of Israel, the Messiah, but that he is, in some sense, the divine Son of God, or at least that he has divine power if he can actually heal the man's leprosy. So I think it's in response to this faith, as well as the suffering of the man, that Jesus then is moved with pity, it says, to heal him. And so Mark, with his favorite word, tells us what? And immediately, there it is again, and immediately he was made clean, emphasizing not just the dynamism of Jesus' ministry, the urgency, but also his power. In other words, it doesn't take Jesus 10 months to heal somebody from leprosy. It doesn't even take him 2 months or 2 weeks or 1 day. He can do it instantaneously because he has complete power over sickness, over suffering, and then eventually, as we'll see, over death itself, which is what leprosy was. It was kind of like being the walking dead, right? You were alive, but your body was slowly dying. So he makes the man clean and heals him. Now, once that miracle is accomplished, we once again see Mark's interest in the messianic secret, or I think it's actually a better term is the secret of Jesus' identity, because it's not always focused just on his messiahship. It's just focused on who he is, who his identity is, the priestly Messiah, divine Son of God, whatever it might be. And in this case, Jesus commands the leper to, quote, say nothing to anyone about what Jesus has done. Instead, he says to go and show himself to the priest and to offer a sacrifice, what Moses commanded, as a testimony to the people. So let's look at each one of those aspects here. First, just with regard to the secret, it's funny here. This is a funny story because Jesus says, don't tell anyone about this. And then immediately the guy goes out and tells everyone about it. And he tells so many people about it that Mark tells us Jesus couldn't any longer go openly about in that particular town. And he has to go out into the country, and people still coming to him from every quarter. Why? Well, because this guy's like the new Elisha. I mean, if he can heal leprosy, what can't he heal? That's the idea. That's the implication of this miracle. So this would have been a very unforgettable act of healing on Jesus' part. And this is the passage, by the way, that has also led some people to wonder if the messianic secret was a case of reverse psychology. In other words, if Jesus was telling people, don't say anything about it, because he knew that they would actually go and tell everybody about it. I don't think that's a good explanation of the messianic secret, though, because you'll see earlier in the gospel when Jesus tells the demon to be silent, he actually silences him and casts him out. I mean, so he effectively renders him mute. So we'll see as we walk through the gospel how Jesus is actually desiring a certain amount of secrecy about his identity until he can explain to the disciples what it really means for him to be the Messiah, to be the Son of Man, to grasp the mystery of the cross, and then ultimately before he reveals it publicly and formally at his trial before the Sanhedrin. Okay, that's the first part. The second part of Jesus' response to the leper is somewhat more obscure but equally interesting. It's Jesus' otherwise puzzling command, go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a proof to the people. What in the world does that mean? It's kind of strange. If you look at the other miracles of Jesus in the Gospels, Jesus doesn't ordinarily, in fact, I don't think anywhere else does he ever say, okay, now that I've healed you, I want you to go to the temple and show yourself to a Jewish priest. That's kind of an odd thing. So what's he talking about here? Well, remember, this healing was a specific kind of healing. It was a healing of a leper. And as we'll see in a second in the Old Testament, reading for today, there was 2 chapters of the book of Leviticus are actually dedicated to the laws for leprosy. So part of the Old Testament was a series of regulations for what to do when a person contracted leprosy, how to evaluate whether they had leprosy, and then also what to do if the leprosy were at some point cleansed or healed. This is one of the reasons, by the way, people think, scholars have said, maybe the word leprosy in the Old Testament doesn't always refer to the most severe form of skin disease, Hansen's disease, but rather refers to any kind of skin abnormality like psoriasis or something like that, that a person might contract in the ancient world. Because if you're giving laws for what to do when the leprosy is healed, then it presupposes that it's actually possible to be healed. But there's lots of debate about that. It's not exactly clear, but for our purposes here, what we need to remember is that Jesus specifically references the law of Moses, and he tells the leper to go and offer in the temple a sacrifice for cleansing. Now, what's that all about? Well, if you go back to Leviticus chapter 14, it tells us that one of the duties of priests in the Old Testament was to examine sores on people's body in order to ascertain whether or not they had leprosy. And if the examination proved that a person had been healed or no longer had a skin disease, then the priest was to instruct them in how to offer certain sacrifices that would reinstate the person into the community and enable them to go back into the temple and back into ordinary worship. Again, as we're going to see in a second, when we look at the Old Testament reading, the book of Leviticus made clear that if a person did contract leprosy, they were not only excluded from the temple, but they were excluded from the community, the wider community at large. So in Leviticus chapter 14, basically, if you want to read it, it's a long chapter. It gives lots of, shall we say, overly detailed descriptions of exactly what the sore might look like, what color the hair would be, whether it has pus or not, that kind of thing. So if you're into that kind of stuff, check out Leviticus 14. In any case, that was one of the jobs of the priest, to examine the sores, and if they were determined to be healed of the disease, a person was supposed to offer a couple of different kinds of sacrifices. 2 birds would be offered, One would be sacrificed and one would be let free, kind of like the scapegoats in the book of Leviticus. And then also 2 lambs would be offered as a sacrifice. And then also when that took place, the person who was healed would wash themselves and wash their clothing. And then after offering the sacrifice, they'd be reinstated in the community. So the reason Jesus tells this man to do this is so that he can formally be reintegrated into the temple and into the community by virtue of the witness of the official priest in the temple who would examine him. So that's why Jesus says, offer what Moses commanded as a proof to the people. In other words, as a public testimony to the fact that you have been cleansed. So Jesus here, interestingly, shows very clearly to us that he was a Jew. I've said this millions of times in my teaching. Jesus of Nazareth was Jewish, and even though he comes to fulfill the Jewish law, during his lifetime, we see even here very clearly that he's being obedient to the Jewish Torah. He's following the regulations of the Jewish Torah with regard, in this case, to the healing of the man with leprosy.